There is a curtain that never opens. Not fully, not freely, that it breathes with the wind, translucent and trembling like a soul caught between before and after. Behind it she stands, not waiting to be chosen, but to be measured. Her breath is quiet, her body still, but around her, the air hums with anticipation, not of love, but of verdict. In marble palaces, gold-lined temples, and courts wrapped in incense and law, they did not ask, does she love? They asked, is she clean? Is she untouched? Can she be owned? Purity was not innocence. It was proof. It was currency. It was theater, and the stage was always hers, but never by choice. They sent in old women with rough hands and colder eyes. They checked for blood like prophets, reading stars. They held up stained cloth like trophies, or worse, like weapons. And in that heavy silence after the test, something broke that could not be stitched back together. No one remembered her favorite song. No one asked what made her laugh as a child. All that mattered was what could be seen, or not, seen between her legs. This was not the story of one girl. It was a lineage of silence, passed from wrist to wrist, like a chain made of tradition. We pretend it's over. We call it ancient, but listen carefully. The curtain is still there. In hospitals, in bedrooms, in classrooms, it doesn't always look like silk anymore. Sometimes it looks like a glance, sometimes a question too early, sometimes a shame too heavy. And the girl behind it, she still waits, not for a man, not for marriage, but for someone, anyone to say, you don't have to prove you are worthy of breath, because worth was never a thing to be tested, only remembered. So we begin here, in the hush, in the veil, in the question that was never kind, not with clarity, not with fact, but with a whisper that refuses to die. How can they tell if she's pure? And more haunting still, why did they ever want to? There is an old legend, never written, only passed between breaths, that somewhere, beneath the marble floors of ancient palaces, lie the echoes of women who bled not from nature, but from expectation. A red thread, stitched through centuries. Ottoman harems, Mughal zananas, Tudor bedchambers, trailing from bedposts to thrones, from silk sheets to scrolls of power. In those rooms, time did not move. It watched. A girl would lie beneath veils and starlight, trembling not from touch, but from knowing that the night ahead was not hers, that her blood, not her heart, not her voice, would speak the loudest. On linen stretched tight as ceremony, a single stain could crown her worthy, or cast her into silence. This was the pact, a covenant of flesh and fear. She was not asked if she loved, he was not asked if she ached, only if she bled, on if she did not. There were ways. Vinegar, razor, a drop hidden in shame, or the cruel hands of matrons, probing for the ghost of virtue, because myth had become law, and law, somehow, had taken root in her body. She was no longer just a girl, she was lineage, dynasty, proof. Even the powerful queens Harimnur, Jahan and Bulin, all knew this silent ritual. How behind every coronation there was a curtain, behind every legacy, a bed, and behind every crown, a woman who had once been asked to bleed for it. Some wept, some obeyed, some rebelled only inward, letting their silence rot the walls of history. But all of them were marked, not by the blood itself, but by the knowing that purity, as they were told, was not about truth, but about spectacle. So much was written in that color, not just pain, not just fear, but the story of how kingdoms are built, not from stone, but from the obedience of women who were never allowed to speak, of what they endured. And now, centuries later, we ask softly, was it ever about virtue at all? Or was the crown always red before it was gold? There are rooms we do not enter anymore. Rooms where silence once sat like a judge. Rooms where women whispered behind veils and linen, and where the air itself carried the weight of ritual shame. They were called matrons, guardians, chaperones, but they were not protectors. They were watchers, and they watched like stone remembers where they're unmoving, but never forgetting. They stood by thresholds, draped not in authority but in tradition so old it no longer needed a name. Women who once bled quietly and were told to be grateful for survival, now charged with witnessing others do the same, not for justice, not for healing, but for spectacle. They held up stained linens like flags in a forgotten war. A bride's body became the battlefield, and her worth, her family's honor, her groom's pride, the whispered judgment of the village, all of it hung in the damp weight of one night's cloth. No man was asked for proof, no prince inspected, no groom examined, only the bride stripped of privacy, of myth, of magic, and made into a performance. She was told it was sacred, a ceremony, a rite, but it was never about sacredness. It was about fear clothed in formality. It was shame, braided into ritual, a mirror held up to a girl and called duty. Some matrons had once stood where she stood, long ago, before their names dried up, before their hearts were folded into silence. They did not speak of what was done to them. They learned instead to hold the door, to listen through the wall, to speak when it was time to declare whether the linen was clean. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes the truth didn't matter, because the watchers always spoke with finality. And in that silence, after they spoke, futures shattered or were spared. Behind the veil of ceremony, there were tears no one dared name. Girls who prayed to disappear, girls who learned to fake blood, girls who learned to smile while unraveling. This was never about purity, it was about control. Control that dressed itself as culture, control that spoke in soft tones and claimed to protect while quietly demanding obedience. And yet, in some hidden corner of the world, in a breath that escaped through stone cracks, the truth persisted, that a body is not a stage, that love cannot be measured in stains, that womanhood is not a performance to be graded in whispers. The watchers may still stand, but they no longer see. Their eyes are heavy with borrowed laws, with inherited fear, but somewhere beneath it, perhaps even they remember, the sound of their own name before it was washed away in duty, the feel of freedom before it was bargained in silence, the truth that what they enforced was not safety, but a forgetting. They forgot to question, forgot to grieve, forgot to ask who wrote the rules they now recite. But now you remember, you who hears this and feels the cold breath of that room, you who sees the linen and not the truth behind it, you who knows that no cloth can carry the weight of a soul. You are not watched anymore, and you are not a watcher. The ritual is breaking, the silence is shifting, but the question still lingers, soft as dust. Who taught us to measure a woman in blood, but not a man in mercy? They called it proof, but it was never that. It was glass, fragile, breakable, and always ticking toward judgment. The hymen, they said, was a gate, but no one asked who built it, or why it needed guarding. Time began not at birth, not with laughter, not even with love, but with an inspection. As if a girl's life could be measured backwards, as if the body could whisper history without distortion. They looked into mirrors and saw no self, only a sentence, only skin waiting to be approved. Their reflection did not speak of dreams or desire, only of thresholds crossed or not. A face became a verdict, a gaze became a trap. Their bodies were made into riddles for others to solve, and so they learned to be still, not in peace, but in defense. The world mistook that stillness for silence, mistook their quiet for obedience. But inside something ancient stirred. They did not cry out, but their bones remembered fire. They did not protest, but their blood hummed like a storm in waiting. They held rituals inside themselves, small, invisible revolutions that no one could unsee once they began. This was not weakness. This was containment, and containment, over time, becomes pressure, and pressure becomes change. Because when your worth is tied to a moment, you begin to question the clock, you begin to wonder who started the ticking. The hymen was never holy, it was anatomy, but they carved it into scripture. They made it a test, a contract, a sentence passed without trial. They used it as currency in markets where daughters were weighed in silence and ceremony. But behind those quiet eyes burned something that couldn't be touched, a refusal too sacred to name. Some learned to bleed on command, some learned to hide the absence. Some learned that even in punishment, they were not broken, only misread, and in that misreading, something began to awaken. A truth whispered like wind behind locked doors, that a life cannot be measured in membranes, that freedom is not a condition of flesh, that worth is not something to be proven, only remembered. Like a broken hourglass, they scattered what was once controlled, let the sand run loose through their own hands, turned the test into dust, turned the verdict into myth, turned the watchers into echoes and the shame into soil. Some still carry the weight, even now, even here. But beneath that weight is not collapse, it is coiled strength. It is memory unchained. Because something fierce survives in quiet girls. Something the world forgot how to name. Not rage, not revenge, but a kind of remembering that no blade can cut, no ritual can erase. And when they look into mirrors now, they do not see tests, they do not see verdicts. They see a path winding inward, toward a self that never asked for permission to exist. A self that speaks in symbols, that breathes in defiance, that walks with shadows and carries light like a secret. This is not healing through proof, it is healing through presence, through the slow return of breath where silence once ruled. And yet, the world still asks for evidence, still waits with outstretched hands for something visible to bless. but the hourglass is already broken, and the question remains, falling slowly with the last grains of sand. What if the thing they tried to measure was never meant to be measured at all? There are rituals that do not die, they shift, they adapt. They trade robes for lab coats, candles for clipboards, linen for language, but beneath their modern dress, they are the same, stone wearing skin. We think the old ways vanished, that the watchers retired, that the rooms fell silent, that no one waits by the door anymore, but they do. They just wear new names. Now, it begins not in ceremony, but in suggestion, not in temples, but in waiting rooms and classrooms and living rooms, with dimmed lights and cautious questions. Have you ever? You still be careful what you give away. And suddenly, the myth returns. Virginity, a word with no bone, no blood, no shape, yet it slices like a blade handed down. They tell us it's different now, that we've grown, that we've learned, but the stone remembers, and so do we. Remember how questions arrive before the girl is ready to answer them, how they linger in the air like smoke, filling lungs with a quiet kind of judgment. We remember how eyes turn glassy when innocence is measured, as if purity was something you could hold to the light and inspect for cracks. The ritual changed. Its tools, but not its hunger. It still waits, still watches, still waits. Only now the cloth is replaced by silence. The inspection happens in code. A glance, a pause, a joke that isn't a joke. And girls still learn how to fold themselves in, to perform, to pretend, to protect what was never supposed to be a secret. Because behind every modern conversation, the old altar remains, hidden beneath pop songs, beneath polished feminism, beneath the language of progress. There is still the offering, still the fear, still the weight of being watched. Some mothers still whisper it to daughters, not out of cruelty, but out of inheritance. They were told, so they tell, not knowing how to unlearn the spell that was whispered into them long ago, and some boys still carry it too. Taught to take or to guard or to compare, never taught to understand, never taught to ask, who gave us this mirror, and why does it only face her? We speak of freedom, but the freedom is often conditional, allowed only if certain boxes are ticked, if silence is maintained, if the ritual is unseen but still obeyed. But beneath the surface, something ancient stirs again, not rebellion but remembrance, not rage but clarity. We begin to see the old shapes in the modern room. We begin to notice the stone under the carpet, and we begin to ask, if this story was carved so deeply into us, can we choose to write another? Because the truth is this: there is no test, no status to prove, no veil to lift. You are not a shrine, you are not a vow, you are not an artifact in someone else's history. You are the living, breathing, aching truth of your own becoming. And the ritual, the real one, is not what they taught you. It is not waiting in a clinic or a question or a stain. It is waiting inside you, where the stone is beginning to soften, where the fire is learning how to speak. The altar was never theirs. It was yours, and it was never meant for shame. So the question remains, rising like smoke from old stone. What happens when the watchers return to find the altar empty, and the girl they waited for has already left? They spoke of a chamber, a hidden room, secret and sacred, where truth would be revealed, where purity would be proved. The door was whispered into girls like prophecy. They were told it must be opened only once and carefully, that what waited inside could never be reclaimed, that the moment you entered, you would never be the same. But no one told them that the chamber was always empty. There were no walls, no gates, no hidden altar awaiting proof, only shadows of expectation cast by those who had forgotten how to see. They waited by this room, mothers, elders, strangers who knew too much about what should be sacred. They watched the space with reverence, as if their own worth depended on whether the girl passed through it untouched. They held torches to silence, measured echoes, looked for signs in blood and breath and gesture. But what were they watching? There is no true test for purity, because purity was never real, only the fear of it, a fear worn into skin like dust in old stone. It was never about truth, only control. Only mirrors held up not to reflect, but to distort, to shape a soul into something legible, obedient, contained. They told her it was sacred, but her worth was folded in her body like a scroll. That one wrong touch could erase the story written there, but no hand ever reached for her soul, only for the illusion wrapped around it. And so the watchers watched, but not her. Not really. They watched themselves, their own hunger for order, their own fear of change, their need for purity because they could not bear their own imperfection. But something cracks when you look too long at something that was never there. and in that quiet crack, a question enters like light through stone. What if there was nothing to prove? What if there never was? What if the girl they prepared for sacrifice was never impure, never stained, never in need of cleansing? What if she simply was, wild, worthy, long before they wrote rules on her skin? The chamber without doors is not a place. It is the absence of illusion. The moment you realize you've been waiting for someone else to tell you you're allowed to be free, and when that moment comes, it is quiet. There is no applause, no witness, only you and the dust beginning to settle. What crumbles is not you, it is the altar built on silence. It is the blade made of judgment. It is the map that led nowhere, and what begins to bloom is not a rebellion, but a remembering of the girl before the ritual, of the self before the sentence, of the truth, that you never had to be proven to be precious, that the watchers may still whisper, but their voices are faint, they echo in empty halls, and you have stepped outside them. There is no chamber, no gate, no veil to lift, only sky, only earth, only you, unmeasured, unmarked, undeniably whole. And as you walk into that wide, unknown, barefoot and unafraid, one final echo lingers like the hush before dawn. What if everything they tried to test was never yours to carry in the first place? She is still there, the girl in the curtain. Not a name in a book, not a statue, not even a ghost, but something quieter, something deeper, a silhouette folded into inheritance. She was never written, only whispered. Her story passed not in words, but in glances, in warnings, in the soft tightening of a mother's grip when a daughter speaks too freely. She lingers not in history, but in habit, in how we watch ourselves, in how we measure, in how we wait to be approved. She never raised her voice, not because she had none, but because silence was the only language the world allowed her to speak. And yet that silence was not hollow. It was thick with knowing, a kind of wisdom that lives in clenched jaws and eyes that have seen too much and are still expected to smile. She survived in silk, not because silk is soft, but because it hides, because it flows, because it moves, like water around stone and leaves no trace of bruises beneath it. They called her obedient, they called her pure, but they never saw the resistance woven into her breath. She resisted in the only ways allowed, in patience, in small refusals, in dreams buried where no one could steal them. And now she lives in us, in the way we flinch before speaking, in the way we dress our truth in apology, in the way we carry shame that was never ours to hold. But she is not a warning, she is a mirror, held up gently, tenderly to say, I was here, and so are you. To remember her is not to mourn her, it is to end her exile, because every time we speak what she could not, we return her voice. Every time we break a rule she was forced to follow, we unmake the walls built around her. She doesn't ask us to rage, she doesn't ask us to burn it all down, she asks us to notice, to pause, to feel her standing quietly behind the curtain of our expectations, because she still shows up in the way we ask questions, in the way we judge one another, in the way we wait to be seen. She is in the pause before we answer. The tilt of the head when someone stares too long, the folding of hands in the presence of power. And yet, beneath all of that, she is blooming. Her story is not only survival, it is transformation. She is the seed under the stone, pushed down, but never dead. She is the breath before the voice, the flame before the fire. And when we let her live, we soften, not in weakness, but in wisdom. We begin to forgive the fear, to untangle the cords, to sing in the very room where once we whispered. We do not free her by forgetting. We free her by remembering fully without flinching, because when we remember her, truly remember her, we do not just honor her pain, we end it. We step out from behind the curtain, we let the silk fall, we look at ourselves, clearly, for the first time. And the world doesn't shatter, it exhales. She is still there, but now, so are we. And in the quiet between us, a question takes shape. If she waited all this time behind the curtain, what else waits for us on the other side? They spoke of a chamber, a hidden room, secret and sacred, where truth would be revealed, where purity would be proved. The door was whispered into girls like prophecy. They were told it must be opened only once, and carefully, that what waited inside could never be reclaimed, that the moment you entered, you would never be the same. But no one told them that the chamber was always empty. There were no walls, no gates, no hidden altar awaiting proof, only shadows of expectation cast by those who had forgotten how to see. They waited by this room, mothers, elders, strangers who knew too much about what should be sacred. They watched the space with reverence, as if their own worth depended on whether the girl passed through it untouched. They held torches to silence, measured echoes, looked for signs in blood and breath and gesture. But what were they watching? There is no true test for purity, because purity was never real, only the fear of it, a fear worn into skin like dust in old stone. It was never about truth, only control. Only mirrors held up not to reflect, but to distort, to shape a soul into something legible, obedient, contained. They told her it was sacred, but her worth was folded in her body like a scroll. That one wrong touch could erase the story written there, but no hand ever reached for her soul, only for the illusion wrapped around it. And so the watchers watched, but not her. Not really. They watched themselves, their own hunger for order, their own fear of change, their need for purity because they could not bear their own imperfection. But something cracks when you look too long at something that was never there, and in that quiet crack, a question enters like light through stone. What if there was nothing to prove? What if there never was? What if the girl they prepared for sacrifice was never impure, never stained, never in need of cleansing? What if she simply was, wild, worthy, long before they wrote rules on her skin? The chamber without doors is not a place, it is the absence of illusion. The moment you realize you've been waiting for someone else to tell you you're allowed to be free, and when that moment comes it is quiet. There is no applause, no witness, only you and the dust beginning to settle. What crumbles is not you, it is the altar built on silence. It is the blade made of judgment. It is the map that led nowhere, and what begins to bloom is not a rebellion, but a remembering, of the girl before the ritual, of the self before the sentence, of the truth, that you never had to be proven to be precious, that the watchers may still whisper, but their voices are faint, they echo in empty halls, and you have stepped outside them. There is no chamber, no gate, no veil to lift, only sky, only earth, only you, unmeasured, unmarked, undeniably whole. And as you walk into that wide, unknown, barefoot and unafraid, one final echo lingers like the hush before dawn. What if everything they tried to test was never yours to carry in the first place? Somewhere in the folds of time, the fire has gone out, but the smoke still drifts. It moves like breath forgotten, through bedrooms dressed in silence, through courtrooms built on performance, through conversations wrapped in politeness, but trembling with old echoes. We say we've moved on, that we've left it behind, but we've grown, evolved, enlightened. But the air still smells like something old, something unspoken, something unresolved. The rituals are no longer lit by candlelight, no longer declared by matrons, or watched through keyholes, but they are still here in the air, in the pause before a question, in the glance that stays a second too long, because history doesn't vanish, it lingers, it hides in fabric, in medicine, in gossip, in law, in the way we measure who is worthy of love and who is weighed for damage. And somewhere deep in that lingering smoke, a question curls like a forgotten hymn. Was she ever yours to test? Was her first night meant to be a trial, a ceremony of ownership, a contract disguised as care? Was she ever yours to name, to measure, to inspect? Or was she always a sovereign body mistaken for a page you were entitled to read? They built myths around her, not because they knew her, but because they feared her, and fear, when left unchecked, becomes doctrine. So, they wrote purity into bone, into blood, into hymens misunderstood as gates to heaven or hell, and then they set fire to her agency, called it tradition, and danced around the flame as if it brought light. But now the flame is gone. All that's left are the ashes. And even in ash, there is memory. She remembers. She remembers how her name was replaced by terms like unspoiled, innocent, untouched, as if her skin was snow and desire a stain. She remembers how her body was watched before it was heard, how silence was mistaken for agreement, how stillness became survival. But she also remembers something else, a truth buried deeper than the oldest myth. She remembers being whole long before the test, long before the questions, long before the fire. And now, the smoke begins to clear. Not all at once, but slowly, softly, like breath returning to a room that has held its lungs too tight for too long. She is not here to perform, not here to explain, not here to ask for permission. She is here to witness what still echoes in the silence, to see what remains after the altar crumbles and the curtain falls. And what remains is her. Her voice, not shaking, but steady, not loud, but clear. Not asking for justice, but for presence, not seeking apology, but truth, because truth is quieter than judgment. It doesn't knock on doors, it seeps in through the cracks. And when it arrives, it asks only one thing: what did we inherit that we never chose to carry? We inherited the fire, but not the warmth, the rule, but not the reason, the ritual, but not the reverence. But now, We are allowed to choose. To leave the test unanswered, to let the ash settle, to walk not into ceremony, but into sky. And when we do, we see her again, not as a symbol, but as a soul, not as a subject, but as someone, the girl in the story, the one behind the curtain, the one beneath the linen, the one in the mirror, quietly surviving. She is still here. But she is no longer waiting. She has stepped through the smoke. She has nothing to prove, and nothing left to burn. So the question remains, not as accusation, but as echo: was she ever yours to test? Or simply someone you were meant to listen to, and never tried?